sorry. All right, so without further ado, we'll jump right into our apple charlotte. All right, so for those of you who have been to the museum, or if this is your first time engaging with us at the museum virtually, I wanted to showcase the museum. The building was built in 1810 by George and Louisa Macculloch. Their portraits are on the right-hand side of your screen there. George and Louisa came from England to New Jersey 1806 and then built their home in 1810. 5 generations of their family lived in this house. It was built in 3 stages. This part that's closest to you on the screen is actually the newest part of the house, built in 1819. The center hall under that portico there on the exterior was added in 1812. And then the original portion is the farthest to the left on the screen. The family lived there. They worked in Morristown. They were involved in their community and had a 26-acre farm at their site here. We take all of that information for programming. Today's program is based on not only the garden journal that George Macculloch kept for the farm, but also Louisa's cookbook, which we'll dive much into as we go throughout the program. So our recipe is apple charlotte today. Now, the apple charlotte recipe in the cookbook that we have is very interesting to us for a couple of reasons. First, the cookbook itself, we call it Louisa Macculloch's cookbook. However, we know that there are a variety of handwritings in the cookbook, and different people attributed to different recipes. This particular recipe is attributed to the initials GMM, which you can see on the left-hand side of your screen, and is dated. Not all of our recipes are dated. Very few of them are. So it's really special that this one is dated. Now, those handwriting experts in the audience can see it's February 2nd, 18. What we're pretty sure is 49. And we'll say why in just a second. So the GMM initialed and dated a couple, just about 6 recipes in the cookbook. They aren't all consecutive in the cookbook, which is interesting to us if it wasn't just all written in a row. So we're not sure what's going on there. We will have a lot more research to do on that front. But who is GMM? We have a good idea, but it's an interesting one. So GMM could be George Macculloch Miller, who is Louisa's grandson. So he was their grandson and lived in the house, and he would have been around a teenager, young adult, tween in 1849, excuse me. So it's possible it could be George Macculloch Miller. We know that other men in the family were involved with recipes. We have a letter from Louisa Macculloch to her son, Francis, also dated in February 9th, where she is talking about what's happening at the house, the snow, etc., and then includes a recipe for rum jelly in that letter to her son, who was a bachelor at the time. So we're not sure if her son was an avid cook or if this was something that they shared amongst their family or if this was an entire family affair. We're not sure. It's something we want to dive more into. We're not positive that GMM is for George Macculloch Miller. The initials match, but it could be someone else completely that we just need to do more research on. But we wanted to showcase a hypothesis that history, we are never done learning history. There's always more for us to discover as we dive through our archives and our letters and continue to do more research at the house. So transitioning from the house, where do apples come from? How did apples get to the United States? Apples are one of the older fruits that are known to exist. They came originally from Kazakhstan in Asia, and even the capital of Kazakhstan is Almaty, which is the word apple is in that language for that. They have an apple festival every year, and apples grow wild in the forests and mountains of Kazakhstan. Now, originally, wild apples are very, very sour. And there's a Henry David Thoreau quote there that I just absolutely love about sour apples, that they're sour enough to set a squirrel's teeth on edge and make a jay scream. So even the animals themselves are finding these apples very bitter. Through the years, apples were domesticated and became the sweet, flavorful apples we have today. Apples themselves are in the rose family, so similar to pears, plums, peaches, cherries, strawberries, and raspberries are all in that rose family of fruits. Next slide. Apples are one of the most popular fruits in Western art, literature, poetry, etc. They spread throughout the country or throughout the world from trade routes from Asia into Europe and then eventually to the United States. By 1300 BC, Egyptians were planting orchards along the Nile. By 800 BC, ancient Greeks were grafting apple trees. And by 200 BC, ancient Romans were planting apple trees in Great Britain. By the time we get to the 15 and 1600s, the Spanish were bringing apples to the United States, Mexico, South America, and other parts of North America. They grow in many, many climates, and so you can find apples around the world. Some of the artwork you can see feature apples from as early as ancient times through more modern paintings. The painting up in the upper left-hand corner is actually a fresco from Pompeii, so from the ancient city of Pompeii in Italy, featuring apples. You can find apples in Norse mythology, in Arabian Nights, in Greek mythology. An apple was supposedly the start of the Trojan War. It's found in paintings and poetry. And so it is really this ubiquitous fruit across many, many cultures around the world. I mentioned that ancient Greeks were grafting apple trees. So grafting is a technique where the tissues of a plant are fused together from two different plants are fused together to continue growing together. So why do you graft apple trees? Apples grown from seed, every seed is going to produce a different plant than the parent. So if you plant an apple seed, it's going to be different than what that seed is. So you'll get a wide variety. That's why there's thousands of different varieties of apples. They are very easy to have that diversity within them. So how do you replicate the same species of apple again and again and again? You have to graft them. There's many, many different ways of grafting. There are experts on grafting. I am not one of them. However, there's many different ways you can do it, and it's been done since ancient times and continues today. In fact, up in Great Britain, the Romans were grafting apples. However, once the Romans pulled out of Great Britain, a lot of that knowledge was lost, and it was actually the monasteries that continued to preserve these plants in Europe or in Great Britain so that they could continue and kept that grafting tradition alive. And then that brings us to 1821 in New Jersey. George Macculloch was a very avid writer about agriculture here in Morristown. He wrote in the Palladium of Liberty, which was a local paper here. And we absolutely found this article and absolutely love it because it references February 22nd, which is just a couple days from now. And he writes this article about grafting trees. And he says right at the top that this is the season when you're grafting trees for the springtime. So right around now, if you have an apple orchard, now's the time to begin grafting to get ready for springtime. The rest of the article goes on for him to discuss the different ages and best techniques for it. But what I found fascinating was that he seemed to favor the native, what he called the Native American fruits, which is, I find funny just because they're not necessarily native to the United States, as we just learned, but the apples that were developed here in the United States, the more recent origin, he calls them. So Harrison or Canfield apples, Raritan sweets, Rhode Island, Jersey, or Newtown Pippins, to the other varieties that would have come from Europe that were imported. So he was most likely planting these in his orchard here. I mentioned grafting earlier, and the seeds. So speaking of grafting and seeds, the legend of Johnny Appleseed. I don't know how many people are familiar with our folk hero of Johnny Appleseed planting orchards throughout Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana, bringing apples to the people. At least that's what I was told growing up, and I think that the children's version of it. However, in doing research for this, we learned that it had a much different approach in the sense that it wasn't necessarily apples for apples. It was apples for apple cider. And we can't talk about apple cider without talking about the apple cider of New Jersey. So apples in New Jersey, for many decades and still today, is one of the most, as we see in the quote above from 1849, it's one of the most celebrated cider districts in America. And the painting below is actually a painting from actually New York, but shows the process of pressing apples for cider. The apples that Johnny Appleseed would have been planting from seed in across the West, what was the West then, would have been used for cider, most likely. By 1810, which is when the Maccullochs built their house, over 1.1 million gallons of distilled spirits were made in New Jersey. And 3/4 of that was coming from apple production. So that's apple cider, apple jack, and other apple brandies, etc. And by 1830, there were 388 applejack distilleries in New Jersey. 53 of those were here in Morris County. It was the second most of any county in New Jersey. So a lot of production of apple cider happening here in New Jersey. Great. The apples grown here at Macculloch Hall, George, I mentioned, had a 26-acre farm. He did have an orchard. The map on the left showcases an orchard and actually was drawn by his wife, Louisa Macculloch, and showcases mostly the pears and plums and apricots of their orchard, but you'll notice up top in the left, there's a couple apple trees labeled. We don't get the varieties of apples that he has on this particular map, whereas you do get the list of the pears that he has in his orchard. But based on his article from the Palladium of Liberty, we can guess that these were most likely those more recent American varieties, if you will, of apples at the time. His garden journal kept track of everything he was growing and planting on the farm and gives us this incredible insight into what agriculture was like here in Morristown, New Jersey. So I just pulled a couple of things that he put in his garden journal. In addition to what he planted, when he planted it, and when it was harvested, he gave us these little notes, these tidbits that I find fascinating. So we have a note that says he planted oats in the apple orchard, and then corn in the 2 peach orchards. So we are getting a sense that the orchards were dual purpose, that they were used not only for the production of the fruit, but growing other crops in them as well as a cover crop, or it could be a grazing area as well. George's account book also gives us an insight into the economics happening at his farm. We have an entry for the Hathaway Cider Mill account, where we're seeing an exchange of apples for cider and spirits in the form of gallons that were being exchanged between the Maccullochs and the Hathaway Cider Mill. So this was an exchange of goods and services with the produce grown on the farm. And then lastly, I wanted to highlight the apples and when they were harvested. So this is just a sampling of a couple of the years here. We have one year where they're harvested on July 4th. They were then barreled on the 20th of November, and then the winter apples would have been harvested on the 13th of October. And so then the next couple entries tell us that they grew different varieties of apples. They had fall varieties and they had winter varieties, and that just tells you when they were harvested. Winter would have been harvested a little later. And then that middle entry, we see that they kept apples through the 16th of March. Now, we don't have a record yet telling us exactly how they were kept, though there's a variety of ways apples were able to be kept in so many different ways. Which is why they were so useful for so many people. They could be eaten fresh, fried, stewed, baked, put in cider, vinegar, brandies. They could be dried, they could be preserves, they could be apple butter, and they could be feed for livestock. So there are many, many different uses. So it could have been a variety of those. And then the last note tells us that they kept the hand-picked apples separate from the fallen apples. So even if the apples were falling, nothing was going to waste on the farm. They were being used for other purposes, perhaps more of that feed for livestock or more into the cider, brandy, et cetera, distilling of the fruits where they don't have to be kept as fresh as if you're eating them. The kitchen here at Macculloch Hall, which actually I am in, you see it on your screen, but also behind me as well, would have been where all the baking and cooking happened here on site. It is in the basement of the home and would have happened here. The picture and then where I'm physically at is what we call the 18th century kitchen. So it's a much older style kitchen and has tools related to that. As the 5 generations here, the kitchen would have changed and would have updated. But we are still learning more about what the kitchen would have looked like. So apple charlotte, I'm going to do a quick introduction for apple charlotte and then turn it over to Cynthia to talk about it. There are many legends surrounding an apple charlotte and who it's named for and who came up with it. And one of the more common one is that it was named after Queen Charlotte, who was King George III's wife. There is not consensus if this is true or not. Different scholars, different references will say yes, some will say no. It depends on the records. It's not clear. There's nothing explicitly out there that says yes, this is named for Queen Charlotte, but it's nice to imagine a recipe named for the Queen, which is why we selected this recipe in the year of 2026, our 250th anniversary of independence from King George III. Figured this was a great highlight and connection to Queen Charlotte, and if only loosely connected. The history of apple charlotte can be traced to a couple different recipes. The first one is in 1747. The Art of Cookery by Hannah Glass has a recipe for what they called a pulpton of apples, which isn't quite an apple charlotte, but very, very similar. So there's guesses that it could have come from these early pulpton recipes. By 1802, John Mullard and his cookbook had a recipe also for pulpton of apples that is very, very similar to a apple charlotte. And then by 1808, we get Marie Rundle's A New System of Cookery, which does have a recipe for apple charlotte. I'm going to go to that slide here. So this is her cookbook, the cover there, her recipe for an apple charlotte, very similar to the one that Cynthia has in our cookbook from Louisa. And we just had to share this incredible quote from the cookbook that says, "Nothing is too trifling for her notice, whereby waste may be avoided, and this attention is of more importance, now that the price of every necessary of life is increased to an enormous degree." So even in 1808, they were dealing with increased prices of food in their baking. Before I turn it over to Cynthia, are there anything we can answer? She's going to go through more of the step-by-steps of the recipe and the how to put it together. Feel free to ask any questions throughout, but I'm going to turn it over to Cynthia.
Okay, excellent. So thank you, Karina, for all those facts about apples and for New Jersey cider making and a little peek into the inner workings of Mr. Macculloch's farm, 19th century farm. And I did want to share the Marie Rundle's recipe, The New System of Domestic Cookery, because it really shows that it has English roots. And Mrs. Macculloch was born in London, England. And also wanted to share it because it was a published cookbook that really was focused on women not wasting resources, time or resources. And that really became a big focus in the 1800s. It was carried on by not only Marie Rundle, who was writing for housewives in England, but it was also Lydia Maria Child's cookbook, The American Frugal Housewife. So the term frugal was right in the title, and that was first published in 1829. Both of those cookbooks, again, were for the housewives, and The focus on frugality was even carried into the new generation of cookbook writers, Catherine Beecher, who was the sister of author Harriet Beecher Stowe. And so I wanted to focus on that. And also, this is a perfect time to focus on that because of this recipe. Some of the other recipes in the Macculloch's cookbook are not so frugal. They are using ingredients that are very difficult to find, like coconut or expensive spices, or citrus fruits like lemons and oranges and vanilla even. So they were trying to make a statement that they had this money to use on their ingredients, especially when they were entertaining in their home. So having the apple charlotte, which is using the stale bread, using up the stale bread in the house, was important to include that in the recipes. It may have been a comfort food, and it kind of feels like a comfort food today, so it might have been a comfort food back then. I hope everyone received a copy of the charlotte recipe that was emailed with the Zoom link. And I always like to start with the original recipe. So I'm just going to read that out loud. Stew any kind of fruit, soak some slices of bread in butter, put them while hot on the bottom and round the sides of a dish that has been rubbed with butter. Put in the fruit and lay slices of bread prepared in the same manner on the top. Bake it a short time, turn it out, sprinkle over it powdered sugar. So that is the recipe that's in the Macculloch cookbook, which is dated February 2nd, 1849 with the initials GMM. Right away, you can see that there are no exact measurements in this recipe, and it's not set up like recipes that we use today. It doesn't list the ingredients first and then following by sentences explaining how to bake your recipe. It doesn't include a temperature or an exact time to bake the dessert, only to bake it a short time. So it's very different from our recipes today, which has made the recipe project that I've been working on since 2020 very interesting, because it's trying to figure out, well, what would be the right temperature to bake that for today's kitchen. One last note about the original recipe, those initials GMM, Karina was showing you who we think might have been the one who wrote this recipe in the family cookbook. When recipes aren't dated, we do have to just go with other ways, other clues that are in the recipe. Sometimes it's trying to figure out by what ingredients they're using. If they are mentioning potash, that would be an early leavener, so it would be like a late 1700s, early 1800s. If they're using baking soda, that would be later, because that wasn't available till later in the 1800s. You could also date a recipe by focusing on the techniques they mentioned. Some of the recipes in the cookbook talk about cooking it over a fire. Well, that's an indication that they don't have a cooking stove that we have today. And the last way would be by the language they're using. So a lot of the recipes in Mrs. Macculloch's cookbook say butter the size of an egg, rather than tell you exactly how many tablespoons that would be. So again, referencing sometimes no exact measurements are mentioned. And I think this recipe also shows the variety of desserts that were available. So when you look at a cookbook from the 1700s and 1800s, you definitely recognize the cakes and what they would call cookies or biscuits, pies and puddings. But a charlotte is in a class by itself. It's not quite a pie and it's not quite a pudding. It's interesting, when I started this recipe project back in 2020, looking at 160 historic recipes that the Maccullochs had used in their house, I really thought there would be more desserts. I thought there would be more stews, but actually there were 2/3 of the recipes were desserts, which really surprised me. But the Maccullochs and the Millers were entertaining in their home, and so they would probably be writing down recipes that they were using for these parties. And also you wouldn't probably write a recipe down that you use frequently, like stews and things. So these are recipes that you wouldn't use as often. And the other thing I learned from doing this project is that most of the recipes are really pretty good. Like, it makes sense. People only write down the recipes they really like. Even today we do that. We share the recipes that are really good. On this table, I have everything we need to make the apple charlotte. I prepared the apples ahead of time because they had to be cool before we use them. I have the bread, which I'm going to start to prepare right now. So I have the pan set up here to warm the bread with butter. And then I have the pan that we're going to bake the apple charlotte in. One 20th century article I read about apple charlotte dessert said it has three parts, and I think it's really a good way to think about this recipe. There's a base, there's a filling, and there's a topping, and really like that description. For the base, we're using bread, and I would say stale or older bread works best. Some Charlotte recipes may call for sponge cake or brioche or ladyfingers. A later dessert, the Charlotte Russe, is usually made with ladyfingers and has a cream filling, and that would be chilled. The Maccullochs do have 3 recipes for Charlotte Russe, but those would be later generations from Macculloch Hall. And so we focused on the apple charlotte just because of the roots in England. I've removed the crust from the bread. I buttered the slices, and I've been heating the slices of bread. And what we're going to do today, I'm making it inside of this pudding bowl. But when I first made the recipe, I made it in a casserole dish. So you can use a 2.5 quart round casserole dish, or you could use a Charlotte pan if you have one, or a springform pan also works well. So I'm very excited. I was sharing with Karina, I was so excited to get a pudding bowl to try this out, because when I was rereading the directions, it does say turn it out, which means you would actually be taking it out of the pan. And so that's why I wanted to definitely give this a try. And so I've used the warmed buttered slices of bread, and I'm going to be covering, so I've greased the pudding pan. And so now I'm going to be placing the warm slices around the outside of the pan and pressing down. So I'm going to just layer them, and it's okay to overlap them because as they bake, they might shrink a little. And you'll probably need about 10 slices of bread. So I'm going to just leave that for now. I've got some more cooking. So the Macculloch recipe for apple charlotte is one of the easier recipes because we're not baking something from scratch. We're not going with eggs and flour and milk. So we're using our stale bread for our crust. And so what I did was when I sent the recipe to everyone, I included the Macculloch's bread recipe, because it really is a very good bread recipe. And so that's what's on the table here. That's what I've been warming in the pan. And so while I'm warming this next set of slices of bread, I just wanted to also share a little bit, go over that recipe with you. But I did want to tell you that I don't consider myself a bread baker. I've actually had some disasters making bread and using a bread machine. I tried making gluten-free bread for my older son when he was like 5 years old, and I had a bread machine, and when I was baking it, the dough was coming out of the bread machine. And I talked to my mom, and she's like, that's never happened to me. So I was just like, I gave up, no more bread machine. That was about 20 years ago. And so this bread recipe right here on the table, the bread, is a great bread recipe. I don't know if anyone makes, I know there's different styles of bread. This is just kind of a classic white sandwich bread. And when I started making this in 2021, my family just enjoyed it so much. We started to make this bread in my house. And my youngest son took on the job of making bread every week because he enjoyed it so much. So it is an easy type of bread to make. And I started to assemble the pieces. I had 4 more slices here, so I'm going to put the smaller ones in the bottom, and just kind of pressing down while they're still warm. So these have been covered with butter and warmed, and I'm adding these slices around the outside and pressing down. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to try to hold it so you can see. So basically the crust is the bread. And then the next step after you've pressed down the sides is to fill the inside, with the apple. So the apple was, again, another easy step for the filling. The apples I used were Rome apples, Honeycrisp and Granny Smith. Any apples that you use for baking would work out fine. And I peeled them, cored them, cubed them, melted 3 tablespoons of butter in a large saucepan. And then I added the apples. I kept stirring them. And then after 3 to 5 minutes, I had a half a cup of sugar, and I kind of incorporated that into the cubes of apples. And then I added 1 tablespoon of cinnamon. So the cinnamon wasn't something that was in the original recipe, but I did see that it was quite frequently used, so I thought I would add that as an option. And so you heat the apples for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then they'll be soft, but not completely like falling apart. So we're going to take this mixture. It has to be cooled before you put it inside of the apple charlotte bowl. And it's probably about, I used 6 to 8 apples, but because this bowl is smaller than the original bowl I used, you will probably only need about 4 or 5 apples for this size pan. Okay, so, and you really kind of want to push it down in the bowl, so we'll add a little bit more, but the apple filling should be about 1 inch from the top. And then we're going to add the last pieces on top to be the cover. So I'm just taking those out of the pan. I did mention that I was going to share with you the baking the bread recipe on this side. So I'll just quickly go over that. Again, it's a very easy recipe for even not to be afraid if you've never made bread before. So you'll use a cup of warm water. It should be about 110 degrees. So you want to get the yeast started while you're preparing your flour. So it's a half a cup of warm water. You warm it to about 110, I should say 110 degrees. Any hotter, it'll kill the yeast. You'll stir in the sugar first and then add the yeast, and you don't want to stir it too much because you could actually end up killing some of the yeast by stirring it too much. So you set that aside for about 4 to 5 minutes, and then sift 3 cups of flour. And some people say you might not have to sift, but when they were in the 1800s and 1700s, they would sift their flour because things kind of got into their flour. So the sifting process did 2 things. It actually put air into the flour, but also it got rid of anything that you didn't want to go into your cakes or your bread. So I sift the flour, and then the flour, the salt, and 2 tablespoons of shortening. That can all go in a stand mixer using the dough hook. And after you've mixed that, incorporated that, you'll add 1 cup of warm milk, and you want that to be about 70 to 90 degrees. So that milk will go in with the flour, salt, and shortening, and then you'll add the yeast. And as you're stirring it, you'll see that it's still pretty moist. So then I always recommend sifting 1 more cup of bread flour and then adding it half a cup at a time. And really at 4 cups, it seems like the stickiness is gone. You'll notice a difference in that bread dough. And then you'll make sure that you mix the dough for about 3 to 4 minutes. Then you're going to proof this dough twice. So you'll remove the bread dough from the mixing bowl and putting it into a large grease bowl. A bowl that you've greased, and you let the dough rise for an hour. It should double in size. You want to cover it and put it in a warm place. And then in an hour, you uncover it, you punch down the dough, and then you remove it from that pan and put it into your greased loaf pan. So that's the second proofing, which is about 45 minutes. It might sound like a lot of work, but it's definitely worth it. The dough should rise about 1 inch over the loaf pan, and then you're going to bake that for 25 to 27 minutes in a 375-degree oven. So just having your house smell like fresh bread, and then be able to use this bread to make the apple charlotte. In previous times when I've made the apple charlotte, I didn't use Mrs. Macculloch's bread. I've used kind of whatever stale bread I had in the house. As long as you remove the crust from it, you can use any type of bread, because that's what this kind of recipe is made for. So right now we've got the bread along the sides and the bottom. We've got the filling on top, and now we're going to just add these pieces to cover the top, and now this is going to go into an oven at 400 degrees for 30 minutes. And I have the finished one here, so I can show that to you. Now in their recipe, and again, the casserole casserole bowl works fine, but it really does, with having the pudding and then and turning it over outside of the pan, it definitely makes it more of a nice presentation. And then according to the recipe, they will put powdered sugar on top. So we're going to put a little powdered sugar on top. I hope you guys can see that. So definitely using the pudding bowl or a springform pan, if you have one, those are all good options. So in doing the research for the apple charlotte recipe, I did find that there are different types of toppings, of course. Everyone has different ways that they've enjoyed it growing up. And please put in the chat if this is if the apple charlotte is something that you grew up with or something that you've made before. We'd love to know that. But in looking at different recipes, you could also put butterscotch sauce on top, custard, whipped cream, fresh fruit, or ice cream, and they all sound like very good options. Other variations that I've seen in the apple charlotte recipe for the filling, that gets interesting too. So once you've kind of made it this way, you can add different fillings the way that your family enjoys it. I've seen recipes that use brown sugar, also walnuts, cranberries, raisins, also could be lemon or lemon zest, and even one I saw that had apricot preserves or orange marmalade. So it definitely can explore different flavor combinations. And as far as other Macculloch desserts that use apple, we have on our website that we've used, they did make a cider cake, and that was featured in the Black River Journal. There's quite a few articles, maybe at least 3 recipes that the Black River Journal has highlighted in their magazine. So the Maccullochs had a cider cake recipe, an apple pudding recipe, an apple tapioca pudding recipe. And as Karina was pointing out, the Maccullochs did grow different types of fruits, and those are all reflected in the types of recipes they had. So they did grow oranges, which is a surprise for this area, but Mr. Macculloch was had definitely an agricultural heart. So he did grow oranges. Recipes also have raisins from the grapes, cherries, plums, and peaches. And some of these recipes are more preserves than for desserts. And let's see what else I found. I found there are recipes that include milk in the apple charlotte, and there's also a recipe that had sliced apples rather than cubed apples. But I'm going to do a little more experimentation with that and see what the milk does in the recipe that's different from our recipe here. One of the things I enjoy about the recipe project is that we're using basically the same ingredients from their time to come up with desserts that they enjoyed over 100, even 200 years ago. And recipes are definitely a fun way to make connections to the past, and whether it's at a museum or with your family. So I hope you have some family recipes. I know Karina and I found that the Library of Congress is actually they have a project up right now that you can help transcribe recipes, and it's kind of nationwide, having everyone kind of join in and work on a recipe project. So I guess before it gets really warm and everyone wants to get outside, that might be a fun thing to do while it's still cold outside. And I'm excited about our next program in March, because we're going to be comparing a coconut dessert recipe from the Macculloch family and with a coconut recipe from another important 19th century Morristown family, the Vail family. Their home is part of historic Speedwell today. The women of the Vail and Macculloch families were all part of the Female Charitable Society, which is another research project that I've been working on. And the recipes have entered into what I've been learning about them, because they would meet in each other's homes. And of course, I'm sure there was dessert and tea. And so it's interesting how these 2 projects have come together. I don't know if anyone has any questions at this point. Karina, does anyone have any questions in the chat or questions about any of the recipes?
Yes. So we have, yeah, I'm off mute. We have someone who made bread pudding with buttered bread in a baking pan and milk poured over it. And then they had it topped with cooked apple slices, which is a German background. So
Nice.
I love seeing where all the recipes come from and how similar they are around the world and how different they are around the world. And then we do have a question. When making the bread, will it stay fresh for the next day?
I mean, I would say it would stay fresh at least for a day. I mean, it's always best when it comes out of the oven, and trying to keep it for the next day. I can't say how fresh it's going to be. I can tell you that when I sliced it, I did use an electric knife rather than, to kind of keep the slices thin. So I did use that when I was cutting the slices for the apple charlotte. But yeah, it is a delicious recipe. Probably 1 or 2 days, maybe even a longer, but it will get a little stale after that.
And I did want to add too, just as a fun little, anyone who's a fan of Downton Abbey, there's a scene where the cook of this mansion is asked to make an apple charlotte recipe, but it's a brand new recipe for her, and she is struggling to make a new recipe from one that she's not familiar with. So it was included in a Downton Abbey episode early on in the early 1900s. So as the recipes evolve and change, they were published for new cooks to make and to have for people. If anyone has, we're happy to answer anything else. Otherwise, please join us for our upcoming virtual program, as Cynthia said, or any of our in-person programming. I put a link in the chat of any of our in-person programming. We have some tours happening at the museum, and are continuing to do programming throughout the year, both in the museum and in our 2-acre garden that's free all the time, dawn till dusk, behind the museum. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you at a program again soon.
Thank you.